Hi, everyone. Oh, okay, perfect. Awesome. I hope everyone can hear me clearly. If you can't, please go ahead and pop that in the chat. You can use that as a sort of space to let us know if there's any concerns or the Q&A. Okay, awesome. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Madison Crawford, and I am the Assistant Director of the Sarah Doyle Center for Women and Gender. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to our latest installment of the Sarah Doyle Center's Gender Equity Speaker Series with Dr. Ayanna Spencer. I'd like to thank you for joining us both in person and on Zoom. This event is particularly special to me, so it is meaningful to have you here. I'll explain a little bit more about that soon when I introduce Dr. Spencer. But before we move on with introductions, I'd like to begin by reading the Brown University Land Acknowledgement, and I invite you to listen and reflect on the words. Brown University is located in Providence, Rhode Island, on lands that are within the ancestral homelands of the Narragansett Indian tribe. The Narragansett Indian tribe, whose ancestors stewarded these lands with great care, continue as a sovereign nation today. We commit to working together to honor our past and build our future with truth. Okay. I met Dr. Spencer about 6 years ago while we were undergraduate students at Spelman College. We met through a mutual friend, Terry Davis, who is also here today. And I can honestly say that their friendship was a pivotal moment in my undergraduate experience. Ayanna was an active member of the Alliance for Fair Labor and United Students Against Sweatshops in the greater Atlanta area. Her commitment and passion for approaching the labor movement with a queer Black feminist framework was a powerful invitation for me and so many others to join. And now, years later, that same queer Black feminist framework continues to inform her academic work, which she will share with us today. When the SDC first envisioned the Gender Equity Series this semester, I knew that Dr. Spencer's research on Black girlhood and sexual violence was exactly the kind of compelling work we wanted to highlight. For those who do not know, the Gender Equity Series highlights speakers whose work takes up contemporary issues of gender equity and inclusion that profoundly impact women, femmes, trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people. And I think you'll find that Dr. Spencer's work does this in a very impactful way, especially when it comes to understanding the particular experiences of Black girl survivors in the US. Dr. Ayanna Devante Spencer is a joint appointed assistant professor of philosophy and women's gender and sexuality studies at the University of Connecticut. Professor Spencer is a Black feminist epistemologist and survivor scholar who earned her doctorate in philosophy with distinction at Michigan State University. She is also a proud graduate of Spelman College, where she became a member of the Phi Beta Kappa Honor Society. Dr. Spencer's research examines epistemic oppression, sexual violence, and criminalization to aid in efforts to dismantle the sexual abuse to prison pipeline. More specifically, she analyzes how Black girl survivors of sexual violence in the US are structurally denied the power to meaningfully act as experts of their own experiences of violence. Her scholarly productivity includes a forthcoming article titled Epistemic Adultification, clarifying the pernicious work of Black girls as prematurely knowing, a noteworthy book chapter, Say Her Name, Maladjusted Epistemic Salience in the Fight Against Anti-Black Police Brutality, and other feminist texts. Professor Spencer is also a co-author of the newly released Me Too International Social and Political Framework. In this lecture, Dr. Spencer will argue that criminalized Black girl survivors face epistemic oppression in the insatiable US criminal justice system in the form of state-sanctioned, non-accidental epistemic burdens. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Ayanna Spencer.
So thank you sincerely for the generous and warm introduction. I'm really so happy to be here. I was saying earlier, it feels almost like a reunion and getting to be with some of my Black feminist comrades that are here in this space. And certainly I want to say a word of appreciation and gratitude for the Sarah Dole Center, the LGBTQ Center for having me today. And I definitely want to give a shout out to Madison Crawford for her vision, invitation, and planning for this event today. And thank you all for being here in person. Sorry, I talk with my hands. I'm gonna try not to hit that too much. And also online. And so I'm here from the occupied lands of the Mohegan, Massatucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Scotticook, Golden Hill Pasquak, Nipmuc, and Lenape peoples, also known as the University of Connecticut in Storrs, Connecticut. To these occupied lands, the Wampanoag, Nagasaki, and Poconet, now Brown University in Providence, during Sexual Assault Awareness Month, the month of April. Now, my lecture today, Fighting to be an Expert of Your Own Experiences, Criminalized Sexual Assault Survivors, and Epistemic Oppression, is a talk about sexual violence, incarceration, and settler colonialism. Important and heavy topics for Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So I want to offer at the beginning one optional self-soothing strategy. So one thing that we can do during this talk, if you're feeling particularly activated, maybe sort of removed from the present space that we're in, and the current time that we're in, maybe you're sort of feeling some tension in your body, or you're feeling a little removed back to a previous experience, is to actually take our hands and link them together at the thumbs as if they're butterflies, and alternate tapping on each side of your chest. Sort of reground and come back to the present moment. Alternatively, you might just lift and place your foot back down, alternating again so that you have bilateral stimulation. So you should adjust this, again, optional self-soothing strategy as you see fit. But the point is to try and give yourself an opportunity to sort of come back to this present moment. Okay? Now, again, given the topics that I'll discuss today, I'll also close with an invitation to do some collective breathing before we enter into the Q&A. Okay? So let's begin. Every 68 seconds, someone experiences sexual violence in the US. Now, that's significant. That's a lot of people in about a minute who experience sexual violence throughout this country. And sometimes when I talk about sexual violence centering the experiences of Black girl survivors, people sort of wonder, well, why talk about Black girl survivors specifically? And so allow me to start by noting why this group that I'm also a part of is centered in my work. Unfortunately, Black girl survivors of childhood sexual abuse in the US are an important group to study to understand sexual violence as a convergence of disempowering systems of oppression. Aisha Sahid Simmons, an award-winning Black feminist, cultural creator, filmmaker, and longtime survivor activist, wrote a powerful introduction to her anthology, Love with Accountability, Digging Up the Roots of Child Sexual Abuse, that highlights the importance of child sexual abuse to the larger fight against sexual violence. She writes, quote, "For too many victim survivors of adult rape, child sexual abuse is a precursor. Ending sexual violence starts with ending child sexual abuse, and ending child sexual abuse starts in the family, in religious institutions, schools, and other spaces in community," end quote. Understanding sexual violence as extraordinary abuses of power by some individuals over vulnerable people within close proximity, the fight to end sexual violence is strengthened by examinations of marginalized survivors afforded limited power in society. Children, especially Black girl children. Black girl survivors are sadly uniquely positioned to illuminate a landscape in which powerful people can challenge and or deny survivors' knowledge claims to sexual violence. In the US, Black girl survivors navigate a sociopolitical landscape of disempowerment informed by the legacy of institutionalized plantation slavery, the rise of what Beth Ritchie calls the prison nation, and the intersection of anti-Black racism and cis heteropatriarchy, which manifests as pervasive sexual violence. There is an awful interplay between violence in interpersonal relationships and violence organized by the state in the lives of Black girl survivors, specifically criminalized Black girl survivors. The story of Joanne Little in North Carolina highlights this interplay between interpersonal violence and state-sanctioned violence. While imprisoned in Beaufort County, Little defended herself against Clarence Alligood, a jailer who sexually assaulted her. As Angela Davis analyzes in Joanne Little, The Dialectics of Rape in 1975, Little's compounded criminalization spotlights public disregard for the rape of Black women, the limits of race-neutral accounts of sexual violence, and the role of the state in organizing violence against women. Her assault happens literally while she's incarcerated, right? So we're talking about extraordinary power over someone. These are the kinds of cases that are particularly illuminating for thinking about sexual violence as exactly that, a violation of power imbalances, right? So Joanne Little was charged with first-degree murder, extraordinary disregard for her vulnerability as an incarcerated Black woman subjected to Alligood's power as both a white male and a state agent. Prosecutor William Griffin maintained that Little lured Alligood to her cell to escape, relying on a kind of anti-Black womankind rape myth intended to recast Black survivors as seductresses and swindlers of men, rather than victims of male violence and anti-Black racism. Although Little was the first woman to be acquitted for murder for self-defense against sexual assault, the state continues to criminalize survivors for their acts of resistance. Indeed, many people might know the story of Cyntoia Brown, now Cyntoia Brown Long, who was convicted of murder and robbery at 16, sentenced to a life sentence, served 15 years, was released after significant organizing pushback by Cyntoia and many supporters. You might also know the story of Crystal Kaiser in Wisconsin, a criminalized survivor who was in a state where there are shield laws that are meant to protect survivors of sex trafficking. Yet when it came to Crystal Kaiser's case, the prosecutor and judge in her case initially argued that that's not Crystal Kaiser. Those laws don't apply to her. And you can't use those shield laws in her defense. We can't use the shield laws to support her claim, her testimony, that she defended herself against the person who had routinely assaulted her, and which, for the record, was videotaped because the person had kept video recordings and the prosecutor has them. It took many years of arguing, both by Crystal, her mother, supporters, and the Free Crystal campaign to get the court system to agree that she could actually use the shield laws in her defense, which is a win for her case, but a bigger win would be to drop the charges against her. And while we're talking about contemporary cases, we could actually go all the way back to the 1800s and remember Celia, who fatally struck her enslaver, who had routinely assaulted her. Unfortunately, the state has a long history of criminalizing many Black girl survivors as somehow knowingly acting with criminal intent instead of knowingly acting in self-defense, despite their testimony and the testimony sometimes of others to self-defense, and instead punishes them for their acts of resistance as seemingly non-victim criminals, As the abolitionist group Survived and Punished explained in their analysis and vision section on their website, quote, in the face of epidemic rates of domestic and sexual violence, anti-violence advocates have partnered with police and district attorneys to try to find protection for survivors and to institutionalize gender violence as a crime. However, this pro-criminalization approach to addressing violence has created a racial divide between quote unquote good victims and non-victim quote unquote criminals. A good victim is one who readily accesses, and cooperates with the criminal legal system in order to prosecute and incarcerate their batterer or rapist. But when a survivor of sexual or domestic violence is only supported when seen as a victim of crime, survivors who are already criminalized are not recognized as people in need of support and advocacy. Survivors are criminalized for being Black, undocumented, poor, transgender, queer, disabled, women or girls of color, in the sex industry, or for having a past criminal record. Their experience of violence is diminished, distorted, and disappeared, and they are instead simply seen as criminals who should be punished, end quote. So there's this class and racialized dichotomy of victimhood centered on a crime framework of sexual violence that exists, just that whole groups of survivors are dismissed as survivors. State agents, often alongside mainstream media journalists, frame criminalized survivors as non-victim criminals to dismiss their experiences of sexual violence, acts of self-defense, and right to pathways to healing. And indeed, it was through my graduate studies that I had an opportunity to work with three extraordinary organizations, Girls for Gender Equity, the Firecracker Foundation, and Me Too International, all organizations you might choose to support during Sexual Assault Awareness Month if you're looking for organizations to support and learn more from. But it was through my experiences with these organizations that I came to think about this sort of ongoing project to map sexual violence, power, and knowledge attribution. I learned from youth Black girl organizers and survivors and adult advocates and allies that the state primarily offers Black girl survivors ankle monitors and parole officers over healing resources and pathways to recovery. There's a problematic intersection between criminalization, how Black girls are expected to respond to violence, and how the state determines what survivors know about their own experiences of violence. And so today, I want to recommend a shift in the anti-violence movement from demanding that people in powerful positions believe survivors to working to dismantle what I'll detail as epistemic oppression. So very frequently, we'll hear people say, well, really, we need to believe survivors. It's unfortunate that people don't really believe survivors, right? We want to do maybe some anti-bias training. We want to get people to see the plight of survivors, right? But I want to push on that today to say that I really want us to think about the role of power in believing survivors. Why is it that some people get to decide to believe or not to believe survivors in the first place, such that they actually have the role of being a gatekeeper to decide what comes next in a survivor's pathway to healing, right? Whether they actually file a report, whether they say, yes, you have entrance to this particular shelter, right? What is it about the actual power dynamics between those who were asking to believe survivors and survivors themselves that might be problematic? And so what I'm really trying to push here is the idea of thinking about the epistemological problem for survivors of sexual violence as not merely about whether people in powerful positions believe Black girl survivors, but the convergence of socio-political and epistemic power to deny what survivors know about their own experiences of violence and power to punish survivors for acting on so-called contested knowledge. And so to do this, I'll first sort of introduce a theory of non-accidental epistemic burdens as the outgrowth of a certain kinds of epistemic oppression. Then I'll outline at least 3 levels of non-accidental epistemic burdens that I think exist, moving through that a little quickly to get to where I really want to focus, which is detailing state-sanctioned non-accidental epistemic burdens and ending with a call to action before our breathing exercise. So first, the theory of non-accidental epistemic burdens or epistemic oppression. So when I think about the landscape in which survivors are telling their stories, when I think about what the landscape of the criminal punishment system actually is, I like to think of it in terms of a sort of boggy landscape that's slippery, has holes, is difficult to navigate. And I like to call this a kind of settler colonial obfuscation of survivorhood. And this is meant to sort of name that there's a landscape that Black girl survivors navigate that includes a kind of criminalizing metaphysical and socio-epistemic quagmire, right? So using the idea of a quagmire or a boggy terrain to describe the socio-political and epistemological landscape that survivors are navigating. So when I speak of this quagmire, I'm thinking here of a historical replicating formation of settler colonialism that elusively constructs survivorhood so that it is difficult to accurately categorize actual survivors as people belonging to the category of survivors with a capital S. And this is more or less a really, really bad punitive situation in which survivors are metaphysically categorized and socio-epistemically assessed outside of legible hegemonic survivorhood when they experience violence. So this quagmire involves both seeing people, survivors here in particular, as potential and actual knowers constructed by the contingent geopolitical formation of settler colonialism, and socio-epistemic assessments, which is about some gatekeeper or third person attributor who has power to determine who some subject or survivor is as a potential knower of some proposition. And here in real terms, that means there's some third person, like a district attorney, who has power to determine whether a survivor is the type of person who counts in that category of survivors and who gets to assess whether or not they're a qualified knower of some particular claim, like this jailer is unsafe. One way of thinking about this is to say that when we think about survivors of sexual violence as knowers, frequently survivors are described as more or less being unreliable narrators of violence, unreliable narrators of their own experiences. And that in fact, when they do share about their experiences of violence, they do so with sinister intent. And you might know an example of this when someone says, oh, so-and-so just disclosed this experience because they want that person to lose their job. Oh, they're just doing that to try and make excuses for their what we would call resistance, right? So this idea of actually saying that survivors as knowers are actually just unreliable narrators of violence. They don't really know what they're talking about. They do so with sinister intent, or what I'll later sort of call acting with this idea of knowingly acting with criminal intent that gets overlaid in the criminal justice system. What I want to offer is that instead, we really want to think about what it means to take survivors as experts of their own experiences of violence and how difficult that is to do when if you're already taken as an unreliable narrator in this boggy terrain, you have all these obstacles, or what I'll call burdens, to get to the place where you're taken as an expert of your experiences. Now, to give this a little bit more grounding, I talk about this as the problem of epistemic oppression, which is meant to refer to persistent burdens that hinder one's participation in knowledge production, where a burden is an irregular requirement to meet one or more extra epistemic conditions to exercise epistemic authority. An extra epistemic condition is a condition on knowledge that is not related to a subject's epistemic position or one's position as it relates to their ability to accurately track the validity of some proposition. And this could be like belief, perception, belief formation, or evidence, right? So it's not related to how a survivor is perceiving the situation. It's not related quite to the evidence they have, because I'm going to say that that's typically fairly solid. An epistemic authority is the ability to use what one knows within a given community of knowers in order to participate in knowledge production, especially to act as an expert of one's own experiences. And so when we have these third-person gatekeepers that deny and override a survivor's knowledge claim to self-defense with regard to a survivor's stakes and constructed subjecthood, they introduce what I'm calling a non-accidental epistemic burden on survivors, which you see here to the left. This is meant to refer to a burden to strengthen one's epistemic position in relation to some proposition, despite having an adequate or better epistemic position in relation to that proposition. So what does that mean? It means when people say, well, we can't take you at your word. We're going to have to talk to some other people to verify what really happened. We're going to need a little bit more evidence to back up what you're saying, right? Despite the fact that you actually are in a solid position to speak as an expert of your own experience of violence. And this is meant to sort of name the actual work it takes to get up this boggy slope, right? What does it mean to sort of point to the sort of epistemic and affective labor it requires to actually prove what you already know about your own experience? That's what I'm trying to point to. And to say that this sort of trek through the boggy terrain is epistemic oppression, based on persistent and irregular burdens for differently situated survivors with varying stakes and different categorizations as victims of crime or non-victim criminals. And so I think there are at least maybe 3 levels of non-accidental epistemic burdens, or from here on out in AEBs. And I say this based on what I think is sort of the level of resistance that burden poses for survivors as knowers. And by level of resistance, I mean here the extent to which that third-person gatekeeper can exert their power within a given community to undermine a survivor's epistemic authority. And so different levels of non-accidental epistemic burdens vary according to that gatekeeper's power to act as a barrier to that survivor's participation in knowledge production. In addressing a persistent and irregular requirement to strengthen their epistemic position, survivors as knowers resist the inaccurate evaluation of their knowledge in order to exercise their authority within a given community. This is significant because typically we want to use what we know about our own experiences of violence as a reason to perform some range of actions, right? To run away, to fight back. And within our given communities, we want to be able to say that we have sort of the authority to perform that range of actions that a survivor might take. But unfortunately, within our communities, there are various people and within institutions and the state at large that have the power to socially and politically challenge the permissibility of survivors' actions in the aftermath of violence. And so, in terms of the sort of three levels of NABs, I draw on the work of Beth Ritchie, particularly her book Arrested Justice, Black Women Violence in America's Prison Nation, where she talks a lot about sort of the concurrent context of violence to sort of respond or sort of add to the work that Beth Ritchie has offered us to say that there's at least sort of three concurrent levels of NABs. First, an NAB within an interpersonal relationship where you have to respond to someone within your sort of personal sphere to justify or explain why you responded to violence the way you responded to violence. A second level, this sort of a group sanction NAB, where you now have to respond potentially to a coach of a sports team, or maybe you need to speak to someone within your religious organization. And so the person that you're talking to has a little bit more power than the interpersonal relationship because their power is related to their role in the group, right? And then third, what does it mean when you're in the courtroom and you have to defend your actions in the aftermath of violence before the state? That's that third level that I'm calling state-sanctioned NABs. So, unfortunately, I think that these non-accidental epistemic burdens are sadly extraordinarily apparent in the lives of Indigenous and Black survivors of sexual violence in settler states. And that it's important to talk specifically about the sort of state level burden. As Dion Millian articulates in Felt Theory, an Indigenous feminist approach to affect and history, Western colonial knowledge systems are structured to reinforce colonial constructions of the inherent deviance of Indigenous women and burden Indigenous women to articulate their alternative knowledge to a state which already, quote unquote, knows them as immoral. Millian vividly explains this problem in her analysis of Beatrice Cullerton's novel In Search of April Raintree. The fictional story showcases a real-world epistemological problem where state level and group level third-person knowledge attributors are empowered to judge an Indigenous survivor's knowledge of sexual violence, while positioned to punish them for testifying to and acting on her knowledge of sexual violence. And in fact, in carceral settler states, sexual violence against Black and Indigenous peoples is historically illegible in law and social imaginaries about these groups, while the resistance to sexual violence is perhaps most legible as inherent criminality. Knowledge production in settler states establish and reinforce that Indigenous and Black women, girls, and gender nonconforming youth and adults are not really survivors, but inherently sexually deviant peoples who act on criminal intent, not their actual knowledge of danger and violence. And in this skewed socio-political and epistemic landscape that I'm sort of calling this quagmire or this boggy terrain, Indigenous and Black survivors have historically extraordinary high stakes and are defined outside of hegemonic categorizations of survivors as being part of this category of survivors with a capital S. And so we have this problem in which survivors are not just sort of navigating the terrain as a kind of one-on-one basis, but are actually navigating a terrain that's pushing more knowledge production down or more rain down that boggy terrain that says we have this whole group of people who are inherently criminal, who act as unreliable narrators with sinister intent. So again, wanting to shift away from the way we might talk about sort of individuals as worthy of belief, but instead to sort of zoom out to the larger structure and landscape. And I think I'm running a little low on time. I'm good. Okay. So returning um, to the four survivors that I mentioned early on: Celia, Joanne Little, Centoya Brown Long, and Crystal Kaiser, to honestly too many incarcerated and formerly incarcerated survivors of sexual violence. The US settler state punishes Black girl survivors as knowingly acting with criminal intent, despite testimony to self defense. And in this way, survivors, particularly Black girl survivors, are not starting at a sort of neutral position of being able to testify to their experiences of violence, to testify to their acts of resistance and self defense. We are already in this skewed dynamic in which you're not just trying to verify your expertise, but you're also trying to sort of push back this idea that you're knowingly acting with criminal intent. As noted briefly earlier, knowledge production in the US settler state dominantly affirms Black girl criminality in legal, social, and cultural spheres. In fact, Sarah Haley captures this significant epistemological problem and backdrop to the criminalization of Black women and girls in No Mercy Here, Gender, Punishment, and the Making of Jim Crow Modernity. She writes, quote, "Carceral gendering reveals that gendered knowledge is produced not merely through male-female binaries, but also through a complex of material and discursive knowledge projects. Normative female gendering was produced through the spectacular cultural and legal production of the Black female invert as a relational and trampled social category defined by deviant motherhood, physical grotesqueness, the capacity for hard labor, the impossibility of sexual, emotional, and physical injury, mental inferiority, and disposability," end quote. As Haley explains, the Western construction of a gender binary of male, female relies on the ongoing production of gendered knowledge that defines the quote unquote Black female as deviant, without injury and mental fortitude, and as disposable. In this way, knowledge production is already skewed against Black girl survivors' knowledge of their experiences of sexual violence and their epistemic authority as knowers to challenge this dominant production. Third person gatekeepers or sort of knowledge retributors who work for the state, like a district attorney, are far more likely to pursue and affirm knowledge of Black girl survivors as criminals than affirm Black girl survivors' knowledge that challenges this available dominant production. Sadly, Black girl survivors are frequently viewed as sort of fast-tailed swindlers, so to speak, a kind of hegemonic construction of Black girls as insatiable, hypersexual beings who con adults or use adults through sexual favors. In other words, these third-person powerful gatekeepers who we want to believe survivors frequently deny Black girl survivors' knowledge claims to self-defense as not equally viable as other available criminalizing constructions. And they do so in a powerful settler colonial socio-political landscape. Their denial is well supported by dominant knowledge production, metaphysical constructions of survivors as a category, and social political power imbalances to utilize state punishment. Leveraging the high stakes of this boggy setup to justify their denial, frequently these gatekeepers can sidestep, or state actors can sidestep, claims of outright prejudice, even if applicable, by arguing that the survivor just doesn't have enough evidence, enough corroboration of their testimony. And this is often said in some form of the following: well, no one was there. There's too much at stake to just take your word for what happened. And thus a further neutral investigation is needed to corroborate your testimony. And I want to suggest there's no such thing as a neutral investigation, right? That boggy terrain already exists. There's more and more water coming down and it makes it harder and harder to navigate. And so I ends with a call to action that really is sort of responding to where I started and wanting to respond to the idea of one of the main epistemological problems for survivors being the need to convince powerful people to believe survivors. And I really just want to draw on Toni Morrison here as we get ready to close out, where she says, "I don't enjoy being a victim, but I enjoy identifying the process by which one is victimized in order to point the finger at exits, not as escape hatches based on fantasy and wishful thinking, not as escape hatches based on reinventing the world the way you would desire it, but real ones, ones in which the knowledge of the past, wide-eyed, confrontational, makes it possible for one to go forward honestly, carefully." And so I've built this sort of theoretical or conceptual work as one way of trying to map and identify processes of victimization and begin to point to exits beyond sexual violence and criminalization by lending to the ongoing work analysis of what I'm sort of taking as the epistemological problem that we have to address. And so where I said, I really want us to shift from talking just about believing survivors to talking about epistemic oppression, talking more explicitly about the power imbalances, I really kind of want us to get on a call of action that says, in response to epistemic oppression that survivors face in this carceral settler landscape, we need to move towards abolishing epistemologies of criminalization for and with survivors. That is the sort of setup where people get to decide whether or not somebody is acting knowingly with criminal intent or some sort of sinister intent, or is acting in self-defense. That actual setup of someone getting to decide and having power to decide that is something we want to do away with. And so I figured one way to talk about this is to say, well, one, all charges against criminalized survivors should be dropped, right? Everyone should be freed. Because the idea that we can have neutral investigations that are going to confirm who the true survivors are, who really acted in self-defense, is already a setup. And indeed, we might want to take some time, since we're here in a university setting, to think about mandatory reporting processes as perhaps actually replicating this epistemic oppression that we're talking about. In what ways are survivors burdened to prove their experiences of violence on college campuses in K through 12? And last, I want to call for folks to support Black girl survivors' resistance, leadership, and expertise, rather than assuming they don't know that you're trying to navigate an impossible situation that may call for fatal action. Now, I said that we would end with an optional breathing exercise. And so I'm going to offer it here because I know I need it from standing up here for this 45 minutes. So what I want to offer is what's called square breathing, where you inhale for 4 seconds, hold your breath for 4 seconds, then let it out or exhale for 4 seconds, and rest for 4 seconds. So 4, 4, 4, 4. And I want us to do this at least just one time. And while you're doing this exercise, I encourage you, if you'd like, that as you're inhaling, that you bring your shoulders up. That place where we hold a lot of tension, we carry it right in here. Bring it up when we're inhaling, holding it, and then dropping your shoulders on the exhale and resting. Okay. So 4, 4, 4 with our shoulders. All right, let's begin. So let's inhale, shoulders up. Hold it. Release and drop your shoulders. Take a moment to rest here. And I just want to say thank you for listening and engaging with this talk. And feel free to connect with me via email at ayannaspencer@uconn.edu or checking me out on Twitter and connecting there at Survivor Scholar. Thank you so much. Maybe I shouldn't have done.
If anyone has any questions on the online, please feel free to add them to the chat and we'll ask them to Dr. Spencer as we go.
Hi, thank you so much for that talk. It was incredibly engaging, and I actually really appreciate the fact that methodologically you're working as a philosopher, and it's like very clear to me that your work is incredibly multidisciplinary. But I wondered if you could talk about the importance of this work being grounded in philosophy, and especially as a field that there are many fields that don't have very many Black women scholars in them, but philosophy especially. And so I was hoping you could talk about that and the importance of that work, of this work being philosophical, and what words of advice you might have for students who are working in traditional, like more traditional disciplines while doing multidisciplinary work.
Ooh, those are great questions. Thank you for that, Caitlin. Traditional disciplines. So, I feel like this has been such an extraordinary day to sort of reflect on my journey from undergrad to now being an assistant professor, because, Madison was sharing at lunch a lot more about my experiences at Spelman College in terms of activism, but also the place where I majored in philosophy. And while I found myself interested in philosophy as an academic discipline because I like asking big, hard questions. I liked asking, but why does that happen? Why is that set up that way? Does it have to be set up that way? And I just love those kinds of big questions. And so, as a Black girl at a historically Black college and a women's college, Spelman College, I found myself in a philosophy department that, sort of herald Black women philosophers like Angela Davis as our like key philosophers. And so it was a really unique experience. And that's what, really kept me, I think, interested in academic philosophy, is that beginning, that start. But honestly, to this day, it is a challenge when I think about the academic field of philosophy, of doing professional philosophy, where I've encountered several people who said, the type of work that you do is clearly Black feminist, but I don't know if it's philosophy. That's the terrain, right? And at the same time, something that actually Christy Dotson has written about, I think it's called Black Feminists Like Me, might be the paper, or it might be a different one, where she talks about the reality that for Black girls like me that like asking those big questions, why, we deserve to take up space in philosophy if we so choose, right? So I want to affirm that as part of what I'm doing as a professional philosopher in a philosophy department, that I'm taking up space as someone who deserves to ask questions, and to affirm that other people, not just Black girls, but other people from different communities that are not well represented in philosophy also deserve to take up space to ask those hard questions, should you choose to do that kind of work. And I think that this is important for the work that I do, because I really enjoy getting into the epistemology. I really do. So when I, talked about this idea of believing survivors and shifting into thinking about epistemic oppression, this came from me really wanting to talk about what does it mean to to believe survivors. Like, what is belief, right? And I feel like philosophy as a field of study offers really good tools for talking about these kinds of ideas and concepts. And so in that way, I'm really grateful for my academic training in philosophy to build out the kind of conceptual machinery that I built out. And then your last question on words of advice for folks in traditional disciplines. I think my word of advice is similar to advice I give just in general, which is find your people. Um, Certainly, it's the case that in these traditional disciplines, that there are a lot of gatekeepers who seek to maintain the discipline as it is, right, as exclusionary. And they'll work really hard to do that. But there are also other folks who came before you who have been trying to shift some things and who have shifted the landscape within your discipline. And so try to find those people, but also find your peers who are like-minded, because it's really through community, intergenerational community, but also community with folks who might be similarly situated to us in our academic journeys that help you not only get through, but who push you to think deeply about your ideas. One of the things I really dislike is when I'm in a room with folks who aren't engaged in some of the topics that I'm interested in within my discipline, and who are like, wait a minute, what's this thing about Black girls? Why are we talking about that? And I got to start all the way back here on the argument. And I don't get to have the more exciting conversations about oppression. What do we do given that landscape? And so it's also important not only just to find your people to have that support, but also so you can have the kinds of conversations you want to have that's going to forward the work towards the just futures that I think perhaps we all want to work towards. So thank you for that question.
And there's also a question from the Zoom chat. And Jayla Stevenson asks, thank you for your talk. Could you say more about the illegibility of Black victimhood and violence against Black women in a symbolic order that does not have the language being to do so? And how can we hold space for that which is perhaps irredressable and that which is lost upon translation, in parentheses, translation?
Thank you. Lost in translation. Ooh, what a great question. Excellent question. So in terms of legibility of Black girl survivors, so part of what I think is important to sort of note is, yes, we can talk about both the reality that as Survived and Punished put it, there is a sense in which Black girl survivors tend to be pushed into the category of not being proper victims of crime, but instead somehow non-victim criminals. That's part of that illegibility. We might also talk about the ways in which survivorhood, just in general, like even as a category of victim of crime, is in and of itself limited for us to be able to talk about the actual breadth of experiences of violence, right? That the legal framework and approach to sexual violence doesn't quite capture the spectrum of violence that people face, right? So it's about the categories of survivors, but it's also about the types of violences that people experience that we might say is less legally legible. For instance, you might have witnessed somebody online or in person respond to a particular case of sexual violence and say, well, I don't know, they were 18, right? Like I don't know if that counts, right? And so unfortunately, part of our social imaginaries are frequently informed by this sense of, well, is it legal or not legal when we talk about violence, right? And that's a limitation as well when we start talking about legibility, because we have to actually push to get people to go beyond just what the law says, but to expand to say, well, you know what, violence is a lot more than what the law even captures, right? Or can capture, which I think gets to your question of sort of how do we actually hold space here. I'm not sure. One of the things that I'm really trying to forward here is to say that the reality is we're probably not going to, I'm trying to soften it. We can't address sexual violence within a settler carceral landscape. I do not think that that's actually possible. And I do think that the boggy landscape is self-replicating, right? So I want to underscore that here, that even as we continue to find different ways of articulating this issue, right? I don't think I'm the first person to point out many of these issues at all, because we continue to have these conversations generation after generation within the anti-violence movement. But these systems replicate themselves, right? And so we'll continue having battles and contests and fights within this boggy terrain. And so the issue then is the boggy terrain, right? It is the actual landscape itself or the structure itself that sets up this contest where one has to try and fight for legibility, right? So that problem is the fight for legibility and the actual experiences of violence. And so holding space really looks like holding space for us to be able to creatively imagine different systems of knowledge, different ways of being able to check in with people and understand that their experience is real and valid, that they're experts. And maybe we don't rely so much on an epistemology that's grounded in there being some third person gatekeeper who verifies what we know, right? That's a particular kind of colonial epistemology that's operating here. So adding that in addition to what can be said about the limitations of language, of legal frameworks and more. There's so many anti-violence scholars before me and activists before me who have names. So holding space beyond, right? Imagining beyond what we currently have. Thank you for the question.
I first just wanted to thank you for coming out and speaking. I feel like the work you're doing is very important. And my question was, it's kind of simple, but I just wanted to ask, like, when you say non-accidental epistemic burdens, like, do you mean like these are intentional obstacles placed in the way of like Black women and girls and Indigenous survivors?
Yes, thank you for this question. Yes, I really do mean it's non-accidental, right? I want to say that it's not happenstance, that we have to fight to actually say that we're survivors, that we have to fight to be taken seriously as knowers. I mean it literally, right? Because I think sometimes we can talk about violence, we can talk about oppression as if this is just the way the world has unfolded over time, right? It just kind of happened this way. And it's just unfortunate that some people get to be in power and some people are not in power. And some people get to be believed and taken as experts and other people do not. And I want to say that no, there's some intentionality to the way that colonial forces have structured the present moment that we're in. And to say that there's something unnatural actually about the boggy terrain. So even though I use that metaphor because I think it's really helpful as a visual to talk about natural landscapes, right? To zoom out from that metaphor and when the metaphor falls apart is to say that this is actually constructed, right? This happened through decisions that various colonial powers made to carve up Africa in particular ways, right? Thinking of the Berlin Conference, what is that, 1884, 1882, right? But thinking like very specifically about the way that like the current moment that we're in, where we're having to have this conversation about burdens, isn't just about sort of individual actors who just didn't know that survivors of sexual violence face victim blaming, face having to navigate this knowledge production that criminalizes a whole group of people. But to say that, like, no, someone not knowing that is actually part of the intentional design of what we're sort of facing. And I mean that in terms of saying the literature that we have, the way academia has sort of functioned is to exclude the epistemologies and histories of marginalized peoples, right? So the idea of, well, we don't have enough evidence to substantiate what you're saying is your experience of violence is intentional. So it intentionally supported intellectuals who took on the task of intellectually justifying colonization, right? To the exclusion of those who would have been writing and were in fact writing and speaking and talking about the fact that this is all a setup, right? So to say, that there's these non-accidental epistemic burdens is to say that, this isn't just an accident of history. This isn't just sort of the natural progression of civilization or the way the world turns, but instead to acknowledge that this is a setup um, that we're facing. So thank you for that question. Yeah. All righty, well, thank you everyone for coming and engaging with my work. I really, really sincerely appreciate it, and for the questions. I'll say, especially since it's Sexual Assault Awareness Month, something I said in another space, which is, I know as a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, when I was a kid, I thought I would never talk about any of this stuff. And I would never write about it, I would never speak about it. And so to now be an adult survivor scholar who gets to speak about and write about these issues is so meaningful to me to have you all here to listen and engage with these ideas. So sincerely, thank you.